Morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's keynote address at the MMPC's Inaugural Forum. My name's Daniel Shepherd, and I'm the MMPC's Social Media and Publicity Officer, and I'm delighted to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Professor Catherine Rottenberg. Catherine is an Associate Professor in the Department of American and Canadian Studies at the University of Nottingham, UK. Her most recent books include the co-authored The Care Manifesto and the monograph The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism. She is also the editor of Black Harlem and the Jewish Lower East Side, Narratives Out of Time. She has published widely on 20th century African American and Jewish American literature, feminist theory, cultural studies, feminist media studies, urban studies, and critical race studies. Big breath. Today, Catherine's going to be discussing her absolutely fabulous 2018 monograph, The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism, which was published by Oxford University Press. So without further ado, Catherine, if you would like to do your little screen share, and I'll pass the floor over to you.
So thank you so much. I'm going to see if I can manage to, yep. No, not yet. Did the screen?
The screen is on if you just want to make it bigger.
Bigger, okay.
Yeah.
Yep, okay. So first of all, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Daniel. And I want to thank you for so much for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honor to be here, even if virtually. I also want to say just how impressive the Midlands Network Popular Culture seems to be, and I'm really very pleased to be part of the Inaugural Forum. And what I thought I would do today is, in my talk, is to give a sense of the genesis of my project on neoliberal feminism, and I hope that will be useful thinking about how these projects emerge. And then I'm going to give a very brief synopsis of some of my main arguments in the book, The Rise of Neoliberal Feminism. And finally, I'm going to just do present a very brief section from one of the chapters, which examines Ivanka Trump's book, Women Who Work. So I want to just say a few words about how this project came to be in order to kind of underscore the particular problematic that I was trying to understand and theorize. So the first time I really began to think about the entanglement of neoliberalism with feminism was in 2012. So of course, this is during the Obama era. Now, as books do, it took me about 5 years to complete the book. And so when I did, it was already 2017, and we had entered into the Trump era. And during those 5 years, the social, cultural, and political landscape in the US had, in many ways, changed quite dramatically. So one could say that in 2012, we had gotten used to what Nancy Fraser has provocatively termed progressive neoliberalism. And with the rise of Trump, we began to see a new configuration, neoliberalism converging with hypernationalism and shameless white supremacy. Cornel West has called these forces neo-fascism, and Wendy Brown has called them libertarian and statist. And of course, one of the most difficult things about writing this book and any book that tries to deal with contemporary events was that events refuse to wait until you process and theorize them. And it's really difficult always to capture a particular cultural moment as it happens in real time, as it were. And this, of course, is particularly true when events unfold and continue to unfold so quickly. And we can think about maybe in the question and answer in the wake of COVID-19, how things have changed yet again. So as I mentioned, the project began in 2012. I was on sabbatical in the US, and this was precisely the year in which AnneMarie Slaughter's AnneMarie Slaughter's Why Women Still Can't Have It All was published in The Atlantic. And this piece, as some of you may recall, created a stir, generating heated debates and catapulting Slaughter, who was a former dean at Princeton and a top advisor to Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. It really catapulted her into the national spotlight. In Why Women Still Can't Have It All, Slaughter comes out as a feminist, and she tries to give an account of why professional women are still finding it so difficult to balance career demands with their wish for an active home life. And she claims that this difficulty arises due to social norms and the inflexibility of US workplace culture, which continued to privilege career advancement over family. Now, what's interesting about Slaughter's piece is that it went on to become one of the, if not the most widely read essays in the history of the Atlantic, and the Atlantic has a very long history. So 2012, this was also the year in which the COO of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg's feminist manifesto, Lean In, was published and instantly became a New York Times bestseller. And in Lean In, too, Sandberg comes out as a feminist. And here she urges women to reaffirm their commitment to work, insisting that this reaffirming commitment to work will provide women more choice about how to cultivate a felicitous happy work-family balance. So 2012, all of a sudden, so it seemed to me at the time, powerful and high-profile women were publicly identifying as feminists, something that we just hadn't seen in the same way in the past. And it was at that point that I really began to read these two manifestos very carefully. Now, I'm trained as a literary critic, so for me, reading Slaughter and later Sandberg was really an exercise in close textual analysis. And at the time, I was struck by a number of rhetorical aspects, but perhaps most of all, by the circulation of what I came to see as a new feminist vocabulary, where you have happiness, balance, and lean in, replacing key terms traditionally inseparable from public feminist discussions and debates, namely autonomy, rights, liberation, and of course, social justice. I also found it really interesting and fascinating that in the wake of these publications, more and more high power and celebrity women were coming out as feminists. So given cultural critics Angela McRobbie and Rosalind Gill, their influential arguments about post-feminism and the entrenchment of a post-feminist sensibility in mainstream and popular Anglo-American culture, where they really convincingly argue that post-feminism had been doing such a good job in disavowing or repudiating the need for feminism, I became really preoccupied with this question as I was writing the book. You know, how can we explain the resuscitation of a feminist discourse and what I would argue, and what I do argue, is a new feminist discourse in mainstream and popular culture? And so as I was beginning to think about these issues, I also began to realize that in order to really understand the kind of cultural work that this new variant of feminism was carrying out, a number of factors needed to be taken into account. The first factor was simply the surge in feminist discourse in popular mainstream venues. And this was true, and my book concentrates on the US, and we can talk about the UK. I think it's also true of the UK. So the first factor was really the surge in feminist discourse. All of a sudden, the F word is everywhere. So in contrast to 2010, beginning in 2012, as sort of an arbitrary marker, today, for example, the F word is literally everywhere, from the mainstream print media to popular television shows, through New York Times bestselling books like Lean In, and let's not forget our former Prime Minister. So that's the first factor, is just the surge of feminist discourse. The second factor is that this mainstreaming and popularization of feminism has often gone, not always, has often gone hand in hand with the defanging of feminism, and particularly mainstream liberal feminism, of its oppositional potential. And many scholars have already demonstrated, more than simply being popularized, feminist themes have increasingly dovetailed and even converged with dominant ultranationalist ideologies and conservative forces across the globe. So that's the second factor. The final factor, which has occurred more recently, is a resurgence of mass feminist mobilization, which in many ways does differ from neoliberal feminism. And I'm going to return to this, to the resurgence of mass feminist mobilization in my concluding remarks. But I just want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I'm not saying that feminist resistance on the ground ever disappeared at any moment in time, or that all feminist discourse had been defanged. That's clearly not the case. But in my work, I've been both fascinated and also disturbed by the way in which feminism has been enfolded into mainstream common sense and the popular media in the US over the past half decade, and how identifying as a feminist has become a source of social and cultural capital and a mark of pride for an increasing number of highly visible and powerful women of all political stripes in the US. And so this was the problematic with which I became preoccupied. So in my research, in my book, I posit that we have witnessed the emergence of a new variant of feminism in the US. And I also claim that this new variant of feminism revolves centrally around a notion, or the notion of a happy work-family balance. So the claim here is that balance has been incorporated into the social imagination as a cultural good, but it's also helped to engender a new model of emancipated womanhood, a professional woman able to balance a successful career with a satisfying family life. So a happy work-family balance, in other words, has been represented as a progressive feminist ideal. And here I'm just some examples that I've been gathering about the sort of prevalence of balance in mainstream and popular media. So this new feminist ideal, I believe, shouldn't just be understood as helping to shape women's desires, aspirations, and behavior, but also, as I try to show in my book, as producing a feminist subject informed through and through by a market metrics. And I'll try to explain and break down what I mean specifically by this. But this is, in short, what I term neoliberal feminism. This is a feminism that has been unmoored from key terms such as equality, justice, emancipation, or autonomy, disavowing the socioeconomic and cultural structures shaping our lives. Neoliberal feminism spawns, creates, produces a feminist subject who accepts full responsibility for her own well-being and self-care. And her well-being and self-care are predicated on creating or crafting a happy work-family balance, which in turn is itself based on a cost-benefit calculus. So in terms of the theoretical traditions that I draw on, as might already be clear, I'm following political theorists Michelle Fair and Wendy Brown. I understand neoliberalism in a particular way, not merely as an economic system or a set of policies that facilitate intensified privatization and deregulation, but as a dominant political rationality or a normative form of reason that moves to and from the management of the state to the inner workings of the subject, and then recasts individuals or remakes individuals as entrepreneurial and capital enhancing agents. So another way of talking about it is neoliberal rationality extends a specific formulation of economic values, practices, and metrics to every dimension of human life. And then human subjects are recast and transformed into human capital. But I also suggest, and here is the perhaps counterintuitive claim in the book, is that neoliberalism may actually need feminism. And why might it need feminism? I claim that it may actually need feminism to resolve, at least temporarily, one of its internal tensions in relation to gender. So as an economic order, neoliberalism obviously relies on reproduction and care work in order to reproduce and maintain human capital. But on the other hand, as a political rationality, and here I contrast it to liberalism, neoliberalism has no vocabulary, has no lexicon that can recognize, let alone value, reproduction and care work. So everything is reduced to the market. And the paradigmatic neoliberal subject is not gendered, is not race, but is generic. And this subject, like everything else, including our political imagination, is reduced to a market metrics and converted into a spec of capital. So the subject is converted into a spec of generic human capital. And so in the book, I also talk about what is different from liberalism, as scholars have also already underscored, is that under neoliberalism, as distinct from liberalism, different registers, political, economic, social, and affective, they all collapse. And all forms of valuation and evaluation transpire through a cost-benefit metrics, through this market metrics. And the disappearance of a distinctive political lexicon is not only due to human subjects increasingly being converted into generic human capital, where gender is disavowed, and I'll talk a lot more about this as I continue, but also because the division of the public-private spheres, which inform liberal thought, and the traditional sexual division of labor is being eroded through the conversion of everything into capital and the infiltration of a market rationality into all spheres of life, including our most private one, the most private ones. So this, in a very condensed way, is a thumbnail sketch of my theoretical framework. And then I use this theoretical framework to read Ivanka Trump's Women Who Work, Rewriting the Rules of Success. So now I'm gonna move to my reading of Ivanka Trump's text. So when Ivanka Trump's How to Succeed Guide, Women Who Work was released in May 2017, it generated a flurry of really angry reviews in the mainstream media. Many commentators excoriated the book, claiming that this newest Having It All manifesto was nothing more than artless jargon, which could just as easily have been found when Googling inspirational quotes. And that's actually quite true. And yet, notwithstanding the widespread criticism, Women Who Work became a New York Times bestseller. And it is certainly true that Women Who Work is littered with decontextualized cliches, and it unabashedly endorses the Ivanka Trump lifestyle brand. But what I argue in the book is that Trump's manifesto warrants serious analysis because it captures and it reproduces a key contemporary and neoliberal expectation that individuals, and particularly women, should never cease working on themselves in order to enhance their value as human capital. So Trump's main message, and the one that serves as her very repetitive mantra, is that women should work on all facets of their life, their careers, their relationships, their family, their friendships, their hobbies and passions. And the address is directed, not surprisingly, towards so-called aspirational women, who are then incited to achieve their, quote, best self, both professionally and personally. And for Trump, success is defined as facing obstacles with resilience, with initiative and creativity, while one's ability to thrive is described as, quote, limited only by one's own hunger, drive, passion, and execution, end quote. So according to Trump, empowerment and achievement involve individual women consciously choosing to create the life they desire and proactively crafting such a life through continuous labor and perseverance. So it's precisely because Women Who Work captures and reproduces a key contemporary and neoliberal expectation that individuals, and again, particularly women, should never cease working on themselves in order to enhance their value, that this, again, this is my argument, deserves serious attention. I think it lays bare really in very interesting and disturbing ways the intensive labor, the affective and physical labor that women are expected to invest in themselves in order to approximate the contemporary norm of female, and here I'm going to argue neoliberal feminist accomplishment. So the ideal female subject is not only conceived of as human capital, but a close examination of Women Who Work also reveals how the self is produced as well as produces itself as an individual firm or a business enterprise. So the self becomes a business enterprise where all activities and practices and behaviors are understood as investments that aim to appreciate the value of the self as firm, as business enterprise. So Trump's text, in other words, encourages women to consider themselves as a form of stock, where their expected role or their normative role is to augment, to increase their market value endlessly. And so this entails incessant labor, particularly the modification of behavior, aspirations, and affective orientation. Much like a corporation alters its practices in an attempt to increase its stock's value by becoming more efficient. The women as stock framework, the women as business enterprise framework, in effect, then conjures up the ultimate neoliberal feminist subject. So it's very similar then to other best-selling neoliberal feminist manifestos like Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, and Trump clearly states her conviction that working toward greater gender equality is of paramount importance, while explicitly acknowledging that gender parity has yet to be achieved in the US. In her introductory chapter, Trump declares that despite the progress and the many advances women have made since her mother's generation, quote, we've still got a long way to go. And moreover, she does advocate for certain structural changes, such as paid maternity leave. So these avowals of gender inequality, which I believe can be understood as one of the signs marking the shift from a post-feminist moment to a feminist one, are overlaid by a much more profound and general disavowal. So Trump spends approximately 1 page of her 212-page book expounding on structural obstacles. The overwhelming majority of the advice she gives and instruction she gives to less famous and less wealthy women revolves around labor, the labor that individual women are required to invest in themselves in order to achieve success. So women who work can be read as exposing the processes through which aspirational women are interpolated as potentially capital enhancing subjects. It's through her constant exhortation that women invest in and work on all domains of their lives that Trump reveals and performs and helps to reproduce the conversion of women from liberal subjects, from ostensibly autonomous rights-bearing liberal subjects who need to fight discrimination in order to gain access to the marketplace to sell their labor, into subjects who must tirelessly work on themselves in order to produce and cultivate themselves as human capital. Moreover, this human capital, she intimates, must be maintained continuously. Every aspect of the self becomes a site of speculation, becomes a site of intense scrutiny and affective investment. It's exhausting. It's a process whose objective is to increase and diversify the self's assets, to facilitate the self's appreciation, but just as importantly, to prevent the self's depreciation. So this totalizing, no, we haven't gotten there yet, hang on. This totalizing approach of the self as human capital serves to facilitate the transformation of the self into a business enterprise, while simultaneously helping to unravel the public, or further unravel the public-private divide. So it's not merely the economization of all domains of life, the reduction of all domains of life into market metrics under neoliberal rationality that collapses the liberal distinction between the private sphere of care and the public sphere of labor, rendering them interchangeable. But it is also what Michelle Farrer calls neoliberalism's apparatus of subjectivation, that helps accelerate the eradication of this distinction between the public and the private. What does that mean? The neoliberal subject herself, now recast as an individual firm, is compelled and encouraged to perceive every and all aspects of her life and self, including, and this is key, reproduction and care work, as requiring continuous capital investment, ultimately rendering the separation of the public-private divide unintelligible. In other words, as neoliberal rationality transforms more and more elements of society into business enterprises, into enterprises informed by a business model with financialization at its heart, not only do all remaining public-private distinctions collapse, but the self itself becomes increasingly indistinguishable from any other kind of business enterprise, which I suggest ultimately undermines the very logic upholding the separation between the spheres. So my reading is that Trump's manifesto can be said to reveal as well as to enact a twofold collapsing of traditionally distinct realms, the public versus the private, as well as one's enterprise versus oneself, one's business versus oneself. The self itself becomes a business. Following her prolonged introduction, Trump urges women to draft a personal mission statement, which he claims will pay certain dividends in the future by helping them to identify their passions and what she calls their true north. This exercise, in other words, will help them maximize their influence later on. So after identifying what women's passions are, preferably in their late 20s, women are subsequently encouraged to enter the business or professional world and to cultivate a wide array of capabilities, such as networking and negotiating deals, quote, thoughtfully and effectively, end quote. These capabilities are considered key for increasing the probabilities of creating a successful enterprise and making one's mark. And yet this is precisely the moment when the boundary between self and business become blurred, since the advice to foster these abilities, networking, for example, or negotiating skills, is meant to enhance not only the business one works for, or in the case of Trump runs, but also, and perhaps most crucially, the self itself. And this helps explain why women who work repeatedly insist that it is important for women who have begun to make their mark professionally to create to-do charts, to, quote, prioritize their time so that they are always adding value, end quote. So planning well, which includes making endless lists about what women want to accomplish, what we want to accomplish, from mission statements to everyday color-coded to-do lists, is central to ensuring that hard work will enhance value and yield the proper results. So again, the self becomes, and here I'm drawing on Angela McRobbie, a kind of neoliberal spreadsheet, indistinguishable from a business where one calculates one's assets, one's losses, and what is more or less valuable in order to decide where more capital investment in the form of developing entrepreneurial skills, resources, or capacities is necessary. So in Women Who Work, the self is unabashedly transformed into a business, into an enterprise. And as such, there is no longer any need to presuppose the separation of the private and public spheres. The reconfiguration and collapse of the private-public divide is perhaps most evident as Trump includes domains traditionally and historically excluded from notions of, quote, boosting one's productivity and maximizing one's efficiency, end quote. And so she includes domains that has traditionally been excluded from these notions in neoliberalism's calculative schema. Hobbies, friendships, and other intimate relationships that under liberalism were separate, at least conceptually, from a calculative matrix are now carefully remade into forms of investment and value management. So while the book merely intimates that decisions about who one dates and marries should be part of this calculus, it explicitly encourages women to foster friendships and hobbies not as ends in and of themselves, but instead as part of the self as business's capital enhancing process. So when discussing the importance of networking for women just starting out on their career, for example, Trump urges these women to make one new strong bond each time they meet people at a party or conference. Now, to be fair, there is some attempt to downplay or play down the instrumentalization of other people, but nonetheless, the emphasis on the new contact or friend as beneficial for business the emphasis is on the new contact or friend being beneficial for business as well as for enhancing one's own value. Indeed, both the cultivation of intimacies as well as self-care and leisure activities are transposed into business-like strategies, which also illustrates how neoliberal rationality and its subjective apparatus dissolve traditional forms of social ties and relations. And that's true even towards one's own self. So what we witness is the economization, the reduction to the market metrics of domains once closely associated with non-market interests of the private sphere. And particularly striking for me as I was reading this text is how affect, once again inextricably linked to the domestic realm, to the private realm, has been or is transformed into its own form of asset or capital. which now requires smart investment so as to increase the probability of dividends in the future. So our emotional investments are now understood as, even the word emotional investments sort of helps illustrate this idea of how affect has been transformed into its own spec of capital. One's affective attachments, one's emotional attachments are perceived as forms of capital to be cultivated and invested in order to enhance the value of the self's overall portfolio. Indeed, savvy self-investment and entrepreneurial strategies of self-care have become paramount. So it's in this way that Trump's How to Succeed book provides readers with a clear, and I would add, a devastating vision of a world in which all spheres of human life and activity have been completely saturated, not only by a calculative reason, but also reconfigured by neoliberalism's moral imperative to appreciate, or at least to maintain, one's own market value as the ultimate aim in life. So, as I've tried to show, on the one hand, women who work clearly exposes many of the processes through which subjects are required to remake themselves into various credit-seeking assets, endlessly working on themselves in order to increase their worth. And Trump lays out in some detail the various kinds of temporal, physical, aesthetic, and affective investments that women must make in order to ensure that they can manage themselves successfully, precisely as capital-enhancing subjects. So taking care of ourselves and professional development are, Trump insists, things that we must prioritize so that we may become the best version of ourselves and achieve our goals. And these activities, again, taking care of ourselves and professional development, are meant to maximize women's value. So what I suggest is that this text can be said to encourage and further enact the conversion of aspirational women into generic rather than gendered human capital. In a sense, then, her text enacts what at the time I was thinking was the newest permutation of neoliberal feminism, and that one that may actually reveal the logical limits of this new variant of feminism. And this process is perhaps best exemplified in the refiguring of motherhood in managerial terms. So Trump does absolutely pay tribute to norms of intensive and hands-on motherhood, but at the same time, she provides various directives about how to better manage the caregiving role. She tells us that she writes lists for, quote, connecting with each of her kids, putting real thought into ideas for producing memorable moments, end quote, that she can create with them. Now, her approach to care work is calculative and reads more like ticking off the right box in order to demonstrate correct investment for eventual returns in the form of future memories. She also informs her readers that she makes sure to have concrete family goals, which then enable her to pencil in time with her family. These goals include official date nights with her husband, dates that are scheduled into the general family list well in advance. In Women Who Work, then, the realm of care is transmogrified into regulated, calculative, and carefully planned affective investment. And the way in which reproductive and care work is presented here, namely in more managerial terms, the way in which their reproductive and care work are presented here undermine in really interesting ways discourses of natural female nurturing instincts. But the way in which they're presented gestures to the further saturation of a market metrics into domains that have traditionally upheld the gender division of labor. And this I suggest further attenuates the link between women, or at least to be more precise, at least a certain strata of women and care work. And so as a result, the ideal female self who Trump ultimately presents potentially challenges traditional notions of sexual difference. And yet, on the other hand, and crucially, the conversion of aspirational women into generic and not gendered human capital remains incomplete. And that's not merely because women are the ones who are deemed responsible for managing the to-do list, Rather, normative trajectory still includes reproduction. That's key. While her ideal of female success remains a happy work-family balance, which is precisely why I argue that women who work should be considered a neoliberal feminist manifesto par excellence. Reproduction and care work function as a pushback to neoliberalism's conversion of aspirational women into generic subjects. Moreover, as Trump extends a market metrics to all domains of women's life, thus contributing to the invisibilization of the gendered care infrastructure undergirding neoliberalism, and I'll say a few more words about that in a second. In Trump's case, she contributes to the invisibilization through the outsourcing of this care, obviously, to nannies and other domestic help, which he mentions maybe once in the entire book. She also, interestingly, repeatedly insists that she greatly values her role as wife to Jared Kushner. And so I found that really interesting because I think that this too, this insistence on wifehood also helps align her or realign her with a certain familial traditionalism. And it can also be it can be understood as part of the pushback against the potential erasure of sexual difference. Now, in my larger project, I go into more detail about the contradictory aspects of Trump's text, and I suggest that it discloses, again, neoliberal feminism's conceptual or logical limit. And the way that it does that is thinking about if reproduction and balance were not retained as part of Trump's discussion, then the transformation of aspirational women into generic, again, not gender, generic human capital would be more or less complete. And neoliberal feminism or feminist discourse would disappear. It's precisely through maintaining balance as part of its ideal on the one hand, while furthering the conversion of women into specks of human capital through this construal of motherhood in managerial terms on the other, that I think that neoliberal feminism appears to be moving closer towards its logical limit. So all that to say that my main argument in this project is that neoliberal feminism has been operating as a kind of pushback to the total conversion of educated and upwardly mobile women into this generic human capital. So by paradoxically and counterintuitively maintaining reproduction as part of middle class or so-called aspirational women's normative trajectory, and by positing balance as its ultimate ideal, neoliberal feminism helps to both maintain a discourse of reproduction and care work, while ensuring that all responsibility for these forms of labor, but not necessarily all of the labor itself, falls squarely on the shoulder of these women. In this way, it solves the constitutive tension within neoliberalism, namely the quandary of reproduction and care work, at least temporarily. Indeed, neoliberal feminism produces and maintains a distinctive and affective vocabulary, lexicon, of reproductive care and reproduction and care work within neoliberalism, even as neoliberal rationality collapses the public-private divide. In the project, I also hypothesized that as reproductive technology develops, a certain strata of women will likely be able to outsource reproduction and care work more and more. And this will then ensure the reentrenchment of the so-called aspirational subject as generic human capital, while simultaneously producing a whole other class of women who are conceived as not fully responsibilized and thus exploitable and ultimately disposable. Furthermore, given the reality that most often women of color, poor, and immigrant women serve as the unacknowledged care workers who enable professional women to strive towards balance in their lives, neoliberal feminism helps to reproduce and legitimize the exploitation of these other female subjects, while at the same time, neoliberal feminist discourse disarticulates the very vocabulary with which to address these vast inequalities. So it's in this way that neoliberal feminism not only forsakes the majority of women by splitting female subjecthood into worthy and then disposable women, but it also facilitates the creation of new and intensified forms of racialized and class-stratified gender exploitation, which increasingly constitutes the invisible infrastructure of our neoliberal order. So just another note in terms of the book, what I do in order to show that Trump's text is in no way an outlier, and I think that that's really important. It's been dismissed in mainstream media, but I think that it's really important to show the ways in which it's not an outlier, and I do that by comparing Trump's text and the kinds of messages that are conveyed in the text with much more the other texts that have been much more widely and positively received. And what I do when I compare these texts is I highlight the three things that emerge really strikingly through the comparison. And the three major issues that I focus on are, the one is that all of these how to success or advice-oriented memoirs all espouse the by now familiar trope of the happy work-family balance, and they present it as an ideal of female accomplishment. Second, all of these texts ultimately place a responsibility for social change on individual women's shoulders. And finally, I argue that all of these texts reflect and reproduce a cultural and political landscape in which more and more domains of our lives are being reduced to and understood through an economic frame. So in terms of time, we're reaching the end, and I want to just in the last really few minutes of my talk, and by way of conclusion, I want to return to some of my opening remarks, and I want to underscore that the variant of neoliberal feminism that I examine in my project in no way constitutes, as I suggested at the beginning, and this is my argument, a threat to the powers that be. It effectively defangs feminism of its oppositional force by individualizing, by responsibilizing women, and by helping neoliberal rationality resolve one of its constitutive tensions by maintaining a vocabulary or an affective register and distinctive vocabulary of reproduction and care work. But I want to suggest also that the notion of a happy work-family balance as a feminist ideal has also helped to render this variant of feminism palatable and legitimate. And it's facilitated neoliberal feminism's widespread embrace and circulation within the Anglo-American mainstream cultural landscape. It's precisely because neoliberal feminism incites individual women to what Sandberg has called internalizing the revolution, and inciting individual women to focus on themselves and their own aspirations, thus buttressing neoliberalism's hegemony, that it can more easily be popularized, sold, and capitalized upon in the marketplace. And it is precisely this process of popularization that may constitute a double-edged sword, because power always produces its own vulnerability. So rather than ending on a very pessimistic note, although I am very pessimistic, I'd like to suggest that by facilitating feminism's widespread embrace, neoliberal feminism has also, and perhaps paradoxically, helped to pave the way for more militant and mass feminist movements, such as the Women's March and the Global Women's Strike. Now, clearly, a lot of the infrastructure for the recent oppositional feminist groundswell was already in place. We know that the Me Too campaign initially emerged over a decade ago as part of a grassroots movement spearheaded by the African-American Tarana Burke, and that it comes on the heels of other mobilizations such as Slut Walk. But what I would like to suggest that in addition to Trump's election and the reappearance of a shameless sexism in the political sphere, which has had its own galvanizing effect, Me Too, movements like Me Too, were able to gain such widespread traction, at least at this particular moment in history, at least in part because feminism had already been embraced and rendered desirable by high-power corporate women like Sheryl Sandberg, Hollywood stars like Emma Watson, as well as music celebrities like Beyonce, to name just a few. So taken all together, these various feminist manifestations all suggest that we are experiencing a feminist renaissance of sorts. And I think that we're at a crossroads on all kinds of levels, and clearly in the wake of COVID-19, that the notion of crossroads is even more urgent. But the urgent question for me, I guess, is how we can sustain and broaden this feminist renaissance as counter-hegemonic, as a threat to the powers that be, while rejecting the neoliberal feminist logic informing how to succeed books and manifestos like Ivanka Trump's Women Work. Thank you. It's so strange to talk to my own PowerPoint.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there would be a loud round of applause if there were an audience here. But we do have lots of people watching on Twitch, so it's all jolly good. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor now for questions. So for those who are watching live on twitch.tv, do feel free to ask anything you want in the chat bar, and I'll feed your questions back to Catherine. You do need a Twitch account to use the chat function. It only takes a minute to sign up if you're not already signed up for an account. Alternatively, you can tweet your questions to me at midspopculture. That's midspopculture. However, while we wait for your questions, I'm going to exploit the liberty of chairing Catherine's keynote by asking my own questions. So, even though you said that it ends on a very pessimistic note, you kind of nevertheless transcended from pessimism to some kind of a optimistic future. The thing I found so fascinating when you were talking was the very notion of happiness, and how you think about someone like Sarah Ahmed, and you think about notions of the feminist killjoy, and how this neoliberal so-called feminism is kind of dismantling the very notion of the feminist killjoy. I think it's really interesting you using the terms how a lot of these women come out as feminists, and you know, instantly with that you've got this implication where, as I see it, it's obviously the very discourse of post-feminism is neoliberalism at work in the first place. Should we be concerned in that neoliberal feminism is, in effect, post-feminism repackaged as actual feminism?
Yes, we should. I do think that what I was trying to do, and I think that one of the interesting things, again, about writing in the midst of all of these really fascinating changes. I mean, 2017, we saw the resurgence of mass feminist movements, is that neoliberal feminism, in a sense, is different. And this is one of the things that Ros Gill and I have been trying to unpack together alongside Sarah Benet Weiser, the differences, how we understand the differences between post-feminism and neoliberal feminism. And I do think there is a difference. And I think that it's not just repackaged as feminist, but I think that what you're pointing to is that the feminism here is I think the question that you're asking me is whether neoliberal feminism is just another name for post-feminism, but it's even more destructive because it has the feminism within it. And I would say that on the one hand, I think that that's only partially true. I think that neoliberal feminism does something else. And what I was trying to argue in the book is that it's precisely about trying to solve this constitutive tension. And the other part of it, where post-feminism has the other differences about the, and this is where Roz has been very helpful in thinking through some of the differences, because she is now thinking about gendered neoliberalism rather than using post-feminism when feminism is everywhere. But the avowal of gender inequality, I think, is important. And I think that we can't just dismiss it as sort of a faux feminism. I think we have to take it very seriously, and that's why the optimism comes later, because it has done certain kinds of things. So that once you avow gender inequality, as one does in neoliberal feminism, there are different ways that it can go. And so neoliberal feminism is the way that I would say we don't want to go. We have to reorient it. But that moment of avowal of gender inequality is key. And I think it's a breaking point in terms of the move from a post-feminist sensibility to a feminist sensibility. And it did move into a neoliberal feminist sensibility, but not only. And that was what I was trying to work through towards the end as I was writing the book, and as it was being in production. All of a sudden we saw this surge of the resurgence of mass popular movement. And I do think it's related.
It's really. Sorry, carry on.
No.
The one thing I thought was really fascinating in terms of talking about Ivanka Trump is the fact that when Donald Trump began his presidency, you had this instant, oh, he's not going to be so bad because he's got his daughter who's kind of going to, save the day, so to speak. So that in itself, when you were talking about this transitional period between Obama and Trump, I thought that in itself was really fascinating.
It was even worse than probably any of us could have expected, right? So maybe not.
I'm laughing because I want to cry, of course. We have some questions that have come into the Twitch stream. One person has written, "Thank you for a really interesting and enjoyable presentation. Towards the beginning, you mentioned how neoliberal feminist discourse has become absorbed as common sense. I wondered how you have conceived/theorized this idea of common sense, and whether you could talk a little further about this."
Okay, I'm not sure I quite understand just sort of the traditional, what kind of theoretical traditions I'm coming from in terms of common sense. It's very much influenced by Gramsci and then Stuart Hall. So it's about sort of how hegemony sort of takes over, and it becomes how we understand our reality. I'm not sure I understand much more than that in terms of the question about common sense. So one of the ways of looking at how sort of neoliberal feminism has permeated sort of popular mainstream media, which is always one of the litmus tests for how commonsensical certain kinds of discourses and notions have become, is by there's lots of research now that's come out in the wake of sort of these discussions on neoliberal feminism, popular feminism, and it's everywhere. So the idea of this individualized self, where women are being the happy work-family balance, as I tried to show in the PowerPoint, is everywhere, especially in the U.S. In the U.K., it's different, and that's an interesting discussion to be had. But the feel-good, happy, going back to Daniel's point about the affect, which is absolutely crucial to neoliberal feminism's happy, positive feminism is absolutely everywhere you look. And that may have changed in the wake of COVID. And that's a question that I am still open to thinking about.
Speaking of feminist killjoys, we have another question on Twitch, which asks, how does neoliberal feminism affect academia?
Oh, I think the larger question is, that's an amazing question, and one that I don't think I've ever had before. Obviously, neoliberalism, I've never been in a country where neoliberalism has infiltrated the academy so much, and I've been in different contexts. Neoliberal feminism, in a sense, is, how has it affected the institution? Well, in so much as we constantly are getting, from human resources, how to create a happy work-family balance, and that's emerged not only from feminism, but from other, cultural discourses that have emerged since the 80s, work-life balance. But a happy work-family balance, as I'm suggesting, has become this neoliberal feminist ideal, in so much as we hear this being bandied about by human resources. That's how it's infiltrated the academy. I would hope that feminist academics are precisely pushing back against an individualized and neoliberal feminism, where it's about the individual and we relate to ourselves as human capital. But I'm afraid that we're all interpolated into neoliberalism, and we do. I mean, just think about all of Twitter, whatever, all these likes, so it's a really good question, and one that is something we should all be thinking about in terms of how feminism, as it's become part of academic institutions draws on a lot of the neoliberal feminist discourse.
We have another question. We have lots of questions on Twitch. It's really quite exciting. Someone asks, on the back of Daniel's, i.e. my question, isn't there a risk that neoliberal feminism undoes the work of feminism in its advocacy for structural rather than personal change?
So this is a larger, I mean, this is a discussion that I've had a lot with, and it's a really good question, whether neoliberal feminism is in fact feminism, right? So that's ultimately the question. And I think, and since you're not here to, help me unpack the question, I'm just gonna go with what I think it is. I am very reluctant to sort of determine what is and isn't feminism. I think and that's in part because I don't want to be I want to challenge neoliberal feminism by what it's doing, not by its identification as feminism or not. And so what I try to do in my work is sort of outline the kinds, the cultural work that it's doing. And I do think that it's a very problematic feminism. I wasn't in any way trying to sort of lionize this kind of feminist. I'm trying to show how problematic it is without saying, oh, dismissing it as not feminist and this is the real feminism. And that's not a political position that I want to take. I think that the avowal of gender inequality here is crucial. And so what do we do then? How do we then reorient this feminist discourse from a neoliberal feminist discourse to a social justice feminist discourse, right? Which is the big challenge.
Ponyu Starfish, which is the user, confirms that you have interpreted their question correctly.
Glad.
Okay, another person writes, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. You focus on the US in the context of a neoliberal global rationality, and I was wondering if neoliberal feminism may manifest in different ways in different countries. Moreover, do you see any connection between your work and Thatcherite neoliberalism? Much of what you said to me resonates with the image of the Thatcherite woman.
I think that's a really interesting point. And actually, my work does concentrate on the US. It's what I know best. Since coming to the UK, I've been in discussions with lots of researchers, feminist researchers, who focus either on the UK or Nigeria, right? So there are ways in which absolutely neoliberal feminism is not specific to the US. It does, though, like neoliberalism, manifest itself in particular locales in particular ways. So one of the things that I would say is that the idea, and be interesting to also to hear from you, the audience, I can't see, whether this idea of a happy work-family balance is as prominent in the UK as it is or was in the US when I was doing this research. It is everywhere, this idea of balance. Now, Shani Orgad, for example, a researcher here in the UK, has looked at how sort of the good wife and notions of the happy work-life balance, work-family balance, have permeated, the UK common sense going back, or political popular imagination, and her claim is that it has. There is a delay, right? So there's a delay, it's taken more time for this notion, and it's through these popular TV series that these kinds of discourses. So we think about the ways in which neoliberalism or neoliberal feminism sort of permeates and extends beyond the West is really, really interesting. And there's been some really good work done on the way in which it's been taken up in different contexts outside of the West. And the difference, again, in terms of neoliberalism and feminist and neoliberal feminism, going back to Thatcher, is yes, there are many similarities, but again, it's this avowal of gender inequality, the ways in which feminism has become a mark of pride and social capital and cultural capital that I think distinguishes. Okay, I'm going to stop. I see that Daniel has other questions waiting for me.
Oh, no, I was going to say, there's a couple of other questions, but unfortunately, much to my dismay, we don't have any extra time, which therefore brings us to the end of our morning keynote. Catherine, thank you so much, Thank you so much for your time. It's really, really was a fantastic talk, and also quite a productive question-answer session as well.
Daniel, thank you so much. And I would also encourage any questions that people have that I didn't answer, feel free to email me. I'm very, very happy to be in discussion and to hear what you all are thinking and wondering and working on. So please.
What's your email address for people wanting?
Catherine.Rottenberg at Nottingham. Nottingham. .uk. I know, Nottingham still.
And there you have it. You can now have your questions answered. My thanks also extends to those of you who have been streaming on twitch.tv. We're now going to take a short comfort break. MNPC's Inaugural Forum will resume again at 11:45 with our research panel, New Approaches to Jazz Studies, which is led by Birmingham City University's Jazz Studies Research Cluster, with presentations from Nicholas Ply, Chris Mapp, Joe Wright, and Corey Mwamba. So to everybody watching, thanks for joining us, and we will see you again at 11:45.